Moscow, January 1961. The air is sharp with the bite of a Russian winter, and the Kremlin walls stand like jagged teeth against a bruised gray sky. Inside those walls, and in the imposing headquarters of the KGB on Dzerzhinsky Square, a quiet confidence reigns. The state security apparatus, forged in revolution and tempered by decades of paranoia, sees itself as invincible. KGB Chairman Alexander Shelepin and his senior counterintelligence officers survey a world map, not with fear, but with a sense of mastery. Their confidence is built on decades of success. Their networks had already penetrated the Manhattan Project through spies like Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall, proof they believed that the West's deepest secrets could always be reached. In the great game of ghosts, the Soviets believe, without a shred of doubt, that they are the grandmasters. Their certainty is built on a simple, brutal philosophy: total control. The Soviet Union is not a nation in the Western sense, it is a fortress. Every citizen is a potential informant, every telephone line can be tapped, and within the military and intelligence services, this control is absolute. Political officers, the Zampolits, are attached to every unit, their true purpose not to inspire, but to watch, to listen, and to report any hint of ideological deviation. Nowhere is this sense of loyalty believed to be more unshakable than within the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff. These are not the shadowy political schemers of the KGB. They are soldiers first. Decorated officers, veterans of the Great Patriotic War, men who have sworn a blood oath to the motherland. The idea that a GRU colonel, a man with access to the nation's most vital military secrets, could betray the state is considered a failure so profound as to be nearly unthinkable. It would be a catastrophic breakdown of the system itself. This confidence fuels the bombast of their leader, Nikita Khrushchev. Just months earlier, he had shocked the world with his shoe-banging spectacle at the United Nations. Now he boasts of turning out nuclear missiles like sausages, utterly convinced that his strategic plans are being formulated in perfect secrecy. He believes he holds the cards, that his next moves in Berlin and the Caribbean will be made from a position of unassailable strength. The Kremlin believes its top secrets are safe. They are catastrophically wrong, because at this very moment, walking these same frozen Moscow streets, is the man who will systematically dismantle that certainty. He is a decorated GRU colonel. He is a war hero, and he is desperately trying to commit treason. His name is Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, and he is about to become the most important spy the West has ever had. The official Soviet narrative was one of ideological strength and impenetrable security. The reality was that the inner workings of the Soviet war machine, from its secret nuclear missile manuals and unit doctrines to deployment checklists, was about to be laid bare on a table in a CIA and MI6 safe house in London. The Soviets believed they were playing chess in the dark, but Oleg Penkovsky was about to walk over to the American side of the board and flip on the light switch. He would hand-deliver the crucial intelligence that strengthened President Kennedy's hand during the Cuban Missile Crisis, providing the critical leverage needed to navigate the world back from the brink of Armageddon. He was codenamed Hero, and his story is one of the most consequential acts of espionage in the entire Cold War. To understand the betrayal, you must first understand the traitor. Oleg Penkovsky was not a simple dissident scribbling pamphlets in a darkened apartment. He was a product of the very system he sought to destroy, and a paradox. His father had been an officer in the White Army fighting the Bolsheviks during the Civil War, a stain on his record so profound that Penkovsky had to conceal it his entire life, at times claiming he had died of typhus. This single foundational lie created a man perpetually at war with his own identity. Outwardly, he was the model Soviet man. He joined the Red Army at 18, became an artillery officer, and distinguished himself through brutal combat in the Winter War against Finland and later against the Nazis. He was severely wounded in 1944 and highly decorated for his valor. He was smart, ambitious, and charming. He rose steadily, graduating from the prestigious Frunze Military Academy and later the Military Diplomatic Academy, the primary training ground for GRU spies. He was a protege of the powerful Chief Marshal of Artillery, Sergei Vorontsov. He was given a comfortable apartment in Moscow and a dacha, the trappings of the nomenklatura, the Soviet elite. But beneath the polished surface, a deep rot of disillusionment had set in. He saw the corruption of the party elite up close. He saw the incompetence and the nepotism that stifled true talent. And most of all, he came to fear the man leading the country. He saw Nikita Khrushchev not as a strong leader, but as a reckless, ignorant peasant gambling with the fate of the world. After Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes, Penkovsky's faith in the communist system, already shaken, completely shattered. He saw a regime built on lies, led by a man he considered dangerously unstable. He became convinced that Khrushchev was capable of blundering into a nuclear war, a war that would annihilate Russia and the world. This fear became an obsession. By 1960, his career had stalled. Despite his connections, a shadow from his father's past and internal GRU politics kept him from the coveted foreign postings he craved. A mix of genuine patriotic fear, personal vanity, and professional resentment began to curdle into a radical decision. If the system wouldn't recognize his genius, and if its leader was a threat to humanity, then he would act. He would offer his services to the only power he believed could check Khrushchev's madness, the United States. His first attempts were clumsy, almost suicidal. In August of 1960, he approached two American students on the Moskvoretsky Bridge, in the shadow of the Kremlin itself. He handed them a thick envelope, speaking in urgent, broken English, telling them it contained top military secrets for their government. The terrified students, certain they were being entrapped by the KGB, turned the package over to a CIA officer at the American embassy. The officer, smelling a provocation, a classic KGB dangle operation, logged the incident and filed the package away. The CIA was wary. It was too good, too brazen to be true. Penkovsky tried again, and again the offer was met with suspicion. The fortress of Soviet security was so effective, it was preventing its most valuable potential defector from getting a message out. The breakthrough came not from the Americans, but from the British. MI6 recruited an asset, a seemingly ordinary British businessman named Greville Wynne. Wynne was an engineer and industrial sales representative whose work gave him a plausible reason to travel frequently to Moscow. He was affable, gregarious, and appeared utterly non-political, the perfect courier. In late 1960, MI6 tasked Wynne specifically to make contact with the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research Work, where Penkovsky held a cover position. During a British trade delegation's visit to Moscow in December of 1960, the opportunity finally arose. Penkovsky was among the Soviet officials who met with Wynne's group. He seized the chance, passing Wynne a package and a message. He was a GRU Colonel. He had access to the highest levels of Soviet military planning, and he wanted to work for MI6 and the CIA. This time the message was received. The package contained genuine, verifiable intelligence. The West finally understood this was no provocation. This was real. The game was on. A quiet British salesman and a disgruntled Soviet colonel had just opened a secret channel straight into the heart of the Kremlin's war machine. And at first, the KGB, the most feared security service on Earth, remained unaware. The operation, a joint MI6-CIA venture, MI6 codenamed him Yoga, the CIA hero, with reporting compartments Ironbark and Chickadee, now moved with breathtaking speed. The initial package was just a taste. Both sides knew they needed direct, sustained contact. The opportunity came in April 1961, when Penkovsky was approved to travel to London as part of another Soviet trade delegation. The spy was coming to them. In a drab hotel room refitted by MI6 technical services into a state-of-the-art debriefing suite, Oleg Penkovsky met his Western handlers for the first time. He was nervous, but also visibly excited, almost euphoric. For years he had nursed his secret contempt for the Soviet system. Now he was finally able to unload it. And he did so in a torrent. For hours a day, over 3 separate trips to London and Paris in 1961, he talked. CIA and MI6 officers debriefed him relentlessly. Penkovsky, with a near-photographic memory, laid bare the inner workings of the GRU. He identified hundreds of GRU and KGB officers by name, exposing the methods, tradecraft, and assets he knew of. But the conversations were just the beginning. The real prize was what he brought with him, and what he promised to deliver. His handlers gave him the tools of the trade, a specially designed Minox subminiature camera that fit in the palm of his hand, and a small shortwave radio to receive encoded one-way voice link messages. His mission was simple. Upon his return to Moscow, he was to photograph everything he could get his hands on. Every secret manual, every strategic plan, every missile schematic that crossed his desk. And he delivered. In what became one of the most productive intelligence hauls from a single agent in history, Penkovsky began smuggling out the crown jewels of the Soviet military. Over the next 18 months, he would provide more than 5,000 frames of documentary evidence. Greville Wynne, the British businessman, became a principal courier, ferrying exposed film in his luggage on return trips from Moscow. The intelligence that flowed into the CIA, distributed under the codename Ironbark, was a bombshell. It systematically demolished the myths the Kremlin had so carefully constructed. The biggest of these was the missile gap. Khrushchev had spent years boasting about Soviet nuclear superiority. Penkovsky delivered the truth. He provided the actual technical and operational manuals for the SS-4 Sandal medium-range ballistic missile and the SS-5 Skeen intermediate-range ballistic missile. The documents were a revelation. They showed the missiles were cumbersome, liquid-fueled, and took hours to prepare for launch. More importantly, this intelligence helped confirm the growing U.S. advantage in the arms race and punctured Khrushchev's dangerous bluff. President Kennedy now had hard proof that the Soviets were operating from a position of strategic weakness. At NPYC in Washington, analysts could now match U-2 spy plane imagery against the actual Soviet manuals Penkovsky provided, identifying missile sites and equipment with high confidence. The shadows on a photograph were given names, specifications, and capabilities. The KGB, meanwhile, focused its vast resources on hunting for bugs in embassy walls, largely unaware at first of the fact that a GRU colonel was walking out the front door of their most sensitive facilities with their secrets on film. By the summer of 1962, the world was a powder keg, and Nikita Khrushchev was preparing to light the fuse. Convinced he could redress the strategic imbalance and protect his new communist ally in the Caribbean, he initiated Operation Anadir, the secret deployment of nuclear-capable ballistic missiles to Cuba. It was a gamble of epic proportions, predicated on the belief that he could install the missiles before the Americans discovered them. It was exactly the kind of reckless, forward deployment his intelligence had primed the West to understand. As Soviet freighters riding high in the water, a tip-off to their bulky military cargo, began their journey across the Atlantic, Penkovsky became the single most important human intelligence asset on the planet. He couldn't see the ships, but he had already given the West the keys to understanding exactly what was on them. On October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flying 72,000 feet above the island of Cuba returned with canisters of film showing telltale patterns scraped into the earth. The photos were rushed to the analysts at NPIC. In Washington, a crisis of unimaginable gravity exploded into being. Inside the White House, President Kennedy convened his top advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm. They stared at the photographs, trying to grasp the scale of the threat. Were the missiles nuclear-armed? What was their range? How long would it take to make them operational? It was here that the thousands of documents Penkovsky had photographed paid their most critical dividend. The analysts at NPIC didn't have to guess. They laid the U-2 photos alongside the Ironbark reports, the actual SS-4 and SS-5 missile manuals provided by Penkovsky. They could identify not just the missile type, but the specific fueling trucks, the launch erectors, and the radar vans. They could tell Kennedy with high confidence that these were the 1,000-mile range SS-4s capable of striking Washington, D.C. and that crews were likely working to make them operational within days. Penkovsky's intelligence gave Kennedy the one thing he needed most: time and certainty. He knew exactly what he was facing, while Khrushchev still believed he was operating under a veil of secrecy. But even as Penkovsky's intelligence was shaping the American response to the crisis, the net was closing around him in Moscow. The KGB's Third Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence in the armed forces, was a patient, methodical beast. For months, they had been hunting for a high-level leak. A tip from one of their prize assets, a British MI6 officer and double agent named George Blake, had confirmed their worst fears. The West had a source deep inside the GRU. The KGB began a painstaking process of elimination. They cross-referenced every GRU officer who had traveled to the West with every major intelligence leak. The list of suspects began to shrink. Penkovsky's name rose higher and higher. The KGB put him under 24/7 surveillance, a suffocating blanket of watchers and listeners. They bugged his apartment, installing a tiny camera in a flower pot. They watched his every move. They were no longer hunting a ghost. They were simply waiting for him to make a mistake. Penkovsky, a trained intelligence officer, knew he was being watched. He could feel the eyes on his back. The pressure was immense. On October 22, 1962, as President Kennedy prepared to deliver a televised address to the American people that would reveal the existence of the missiles and announce a naval quarantine of Cuba, the KGB decided they had waited long enough. Oleg Penkovsky was arrested. The West's most vital channel into the Kremlin had just gone silent at the very moment the world stood on the precipice of nuclear war. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers stood eyeball to eyeball. In the end, it was Khrushchev who blinked. On October 28th, he agreed to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to withdraw American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. The world stepped back from the abyss. While Kennedy was praised for his cool-headed statesmanship, the true extent of his informational advantage was a secret largely hidden from the public at the time. They did not know that the president was negotiating while armed with the enemy's playbook, courtesy of a man who was now facing the grim justice of the Soviet state. In the KGB's infamous Lubyanka prison, Oleg Penkovsky was subjected to relentless interrogation. In May 1963, he and Greville Wynne were put on public display in a classic Soviet show trial. Penkovsky, gaunt and broken, confessed to everything. He was sentenced to death for treason. Wynne was sentenced to 8 years in a labor camp. The official Soviet account states that Oleg Penkovsky was executed by shooting on May 16, 1963. Darker, more gruesome rumors have persisted for decades, whispered by former intelligence officers, that he was cremated alive as a horrific warning to any others who might consider betrayal. Whatever the truth, his life ended in the brutal machinery of the state he had sought to undermine. Greville Wynne would be exchanged in 1964 for a captured Soviet spy, a broken man who never fully recovered from his ordeal. The Kremlin tried to spin the affair as a triumph of their counterintelligence, proof that no traitor could escape their reach. But this was a hollow boast, a desperate attempt to mask a catastrophic failure. They had caught him, yes, but only after he had given away the store. For 18 critical months, the entire Soviet military posture, its most advanced weaponry, and its strategic intentions had been an open book to the West. The damage was incalculable. This was not just a Western assessment. This was the cold, hard conclusion of the Soviets themselves. In the aftermath, General Pyotr Ivashutin, the newly appointed head of the GRU, led a sweeping post-mortem and reorganization, an implicit admission of the scale of the failure. Decades later, another Russian intelligence chief would call Penkovsky the biggest intelligence failure in the nation's history. In January of 1961, the Kremlin had believed its secrets were safe, protected by an ideology of fear and a system of total control. They were certain of the loyalty of their men, especially their decorated military intelligence colonels. They learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that their fortress had a gaping hole in its heart. It wasn't breached by a rival superpower's technology, but by the quiet conviction of a single disillusioned man with a Menox camera. Oleg Penkovsky, the spy codenamed Hero, proved that the greatest threat to a closed system built on lies is not an external enemy, but an insider who decides to tell the truth.